8 battles in which deception, misdirection, or manipulation shaped the outcome before the enemy fully understood what was happening. The winner did not always have the larger army, the stronger position, or the numerical advantage. Sometimes the decisive edge came from a false retreat, a deliberate weakness, a hidden crossing, or one carefully planted lie. These are 8 battles where deception became a weapon. Salamis, 480 BCE. The Persian king Xerxes had brought an enormous invasion force into Greece. Athens had already been evacuated and burned. On land, the Persians appeared almost impossible to stop. At sea, they still possessed a major advantage in numbers. The Greek commander Themistocles understood the problem. Fighting in open water would give the larger Persian fleet more room to exploit its numerical superiority. He needed Xerxes to move his ships somewhere that advantage would matter far less. So Themistocles sent a secret message to the Persian king. According to Herodotus, a servant named Sisinus carried it. He told Xerxes that the Greek alliance was falling apart and that its ships were preparing to escape. The message also implied that Themistocles secretly favored the Persian side. Xerxes acted on the information. During the night, Persian ships moved to block the exits from the narrow waters around Salamis. The maneuver was intended to trap an enemy supposedly preparing to flee. Instead, it forced the Persian fleet into the kind of battlefield the Greeks wanted. When fighting began, the confined waters limited the Persians' ability to exploit their greater numbers. Ships crowded together. Formations became difficult to maintain. Greek triremes, operating in a more compact space, could engage the Persian fleet without being easily surrounded. Xerxes reportedly watched the battle from the shore. The Greeks had not been preparing to escape. They had been preparing to fight. Persia entered the strait expecting to close a trap. Instead, it entered the battlefield Themistocles had chosen, Hydaspes, 326 BCE. Alexander the Great faced King Porus across the Hydaspes River, generally identified with the Jhelum in modern Pakistan. The river itself was the first obstacle. It was swollen by seasonal rains, and Porus had positioned his army on the opposite bank. His war elephants made a direct crossing especially dangerous. Horses could panic near them, while soldiers emerging from deep water would be vulnerable before they could form battle lines. Alexander could not simply cross in front of Porus. So for days, he repeatedly behaved as if he might. Macedonian troops marched along the river. Cavalry appeared at possible crossing points. Boats and rafts were prepared. Camps remained active. Porus responded to these movements again and again. Then nothing happened. As the pattern continued, repeated Macedonian preparations became less informative. Porus still had to guard the river, but Alexander had made it increasingly difficult to distinguish routine activity from the real attack. Eventually, Alexander selected a crossing point well upstream from the main camps. During a stormy night, part of the Macedonian army moved toward it. Craterus remained behind with another force, maintaining activity opposite Porus and helping preserve the impression that the main crossing might still happen there. Porus could not be certain where Alexander intended to strike. When Alexander finally crossed with cavalry and infantry, he gained enough time to establish a force on the far bank before Porus could bring his entire army against him. The battle that followed was still difficult. Porus and his elephants fought fiercely, but Alexander had already solved the first problem. Porus had to defend a river. Alexander made him defend possibilities, Lake Trasimene, 217 BCE. Hannibal had already crossed the Alps and defeated Roman armies in northern Italy. Rome sent the consul Gaius Flaminius to confront him. Hannibal understood that Flaminius was willing to pursue aggressively, so he gave him something to pursue. The Carthaginian army moved through Etruria, devastating Roman territory and drawing Flaminius after it. Hannibal then selected terrain near Lake Trasimene that was exceptionally favorable for an ambush. A road passed through confined ground between the lake and the surrounding hills. Hannibal concealed troops along the heights and positioned stronger forces to block the Roman advance. Morning mist may have further reduced visibility. The Roman column entered the area without deploying for a conventional battle. Then Hannibal attacked. Carthaginian troops descended from concealed positions while other forces blocked movement ahead. The lake restricted escape on one side. The hills and attacking troops restricted it on the other. Much of the Roman army had little opportunity to form a coherent battle line. Flaminius was killed, and the Roman force suffered catastrophic losses. Ancient accounts differ over exact numbers, but thousands were killed and many more captured. Hannibal had not defeated Rome simply by being stronger. He had arranged the battlefield so that the Romans entered it on his terms. Rome expected to catch an enemy on the move. Instead, it marched into an ambush already prepared for its arrival. Cannae, 216 BCE. 1 year after Lake Trasimene, Rome attempted to solve the Hannibal problem with overwhelming force. The Republic assembled one of the largest armies it had ever placed in the field. Ancient figures vary, but the Roman and allied force was substantially larger than Hannibal's. On August 2nd, the armies met near Cannae in southeastern Italy. Roman commanders concentrated much of their heavy infantry into an unusually deep formation. The purpose was straightforward: break through the Carthaginian center. Hannibal shaped his deployment around that expectation. His Spanish and Gallic infantry formed a curved center projecting toward the Romans. As the Roman infantry advanced, Hannibal's center gradually gave ground. It looked increasingly vulnerable. The Romans continued forward. As they pressed into the Carthaginian position, their dense formation became increasingly compressed. Meanwhile, Hannibal's African infantry, positioned farther back on both sides, turned inward against the Roman flanks. Then the cavalry completed the encirclement. After defeating the Roman cavalry outside the main infantry battle, Carthaginian horsemen returned and attacked the Roman rear. The Roman infantry was trapped. Front, flanks, rear. The formation designed to punch through Hannibal's center had become a mass of soldiers with little room to maneuver. Ancient casualty figures differ sharply. Livy's account implies more than 50,000 Roman and allied dead when cavalry and other losses are included, while Polybius gives a figure closer to 70,000 killed. Whatever the exact number, Cannae became one of the worst military disasters in Roman history. The Romans had advanced into what appeared to be Hannibal's weakest point. The weakness was real enough to invite them forward. The shape of the battlefield that followed was Hannibal's design, the Kalka River, 1223. Long before the Mongols conquered large parts of Eastern Europe, a Mongol expedition encountered an alliance of Rus's princes and Cuman forces. The Mongols were operating far from the main centers of their empire. Their opponents could potentially assemble substantial local forces. The Mongols withdrew, and the coalition followed. Sources describing the campaign portray a pursuit lasting for days, as the Mongol army continued eastward. Whether every stage of that retreat was planned in advance cannot be known with certainty, but the effect was clear. The pursuit stretched the coalition. Different contingents moved at different speeds. Coordination weakened. The distance from secure territory increased. The Mongols continued withdrawing. Then, near the Kalka River, they turned. On May 31, 1223, Mongol forces attacked a coalition that was no longer moving as one tightly coordinated army. Cuman forces were driven back, while Rus's contingents entered the battle unevenly. Several princes eventually attempted to hold fortified positions, but were overwhelmed. The defeat was severe. Some medieval accounts claim that captured Rus's princes were placed beneath wooden boards, while Mongol commanders held a victory feast above them, though the details vary between sources. The Mongols had not simply escaped from a stronger force. Their withdrawal had encouraged the coalition to extend itself across distance and time. For days, the Rus and Cumans believed they were pursuing the Mongols. By the end, the pursuit had helped create the conditions for their own defeat. Austerlitz, 1805. Napoleon Bonaparte faced Russian and Austrian armies near Austerlitz on December 2nd. The Allied commanders believed they had identified a weakness. Napoleon encouraged that belief. His right flank appeared dangerously thin. He had abandoned the dominant Pratzen Heights and presented a position that seemed vulnerable to an Allied attack in the south. The Allies decided to exploit it. Before dawn, significant portions of their army began moving away from the Pratzen Heights to attack Napoleon's right. That movement was exactly what Napoleon needed. Marshal Davout was marching toward the threatened sector with reinforcements, while Napoleon waited for the Allied center to become weaker. Then the French attacked it. Dalschull-Soult's corps advanced toward the Pratzen Heights. The position the Allies had occupied earlier was now thinly defended because their own offensive plan had drawn troops away from it. French forces seized the heights and drove into the Allied center. The Allied army was effectively divided. Forces fighting in the south became increasingly separated from those farther north, while Napoleon controlled the central ground between them. Later accounts turned the Allied retreat across frozen ponds into stories of enormous numbers of men drowning after French artillery shattered the ice. Evidence suggests the scale of those drownings was heavily exaggerated. Napoleon did not need the legend. The real maneuver was enough. He showed the Allies a weakness. Their attempt to exploit it helped create a weakness of their own. Cowpens, 1781. During the American Revolutionary War, Brigadier General Daniel Morgan faced Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton in South Carolina. Tarleton had a reputation for aggressive attacks. Morgan built his plan around that tendency. On January 17, he arranged his force in several layers. Skirmishers stood in front. Behind them were militia troops. Continental regulars waited farther back. The militia received unusually specific instructions. Fire 2 effective volleys, then withdraw. Retreating militia often signaled the beginning of a collapse. Morgan intended this withdrawal to be controlled. Tarleton attacked. American skirmishers fired and fell back. The militia delivered its volleys, inflicted casualties, and then withdrew as ordered. From the British perspective, the American position appeared to be weakening. Tarleton pressed forward. His troops advanced toward the Continental line, while the militia moved behind it and began reorganizing. Then something happened that Morgan had not planned. A command to shift part of the American line was misunderstood as an order to retreat. Soldiers began moving backward in good order. The British interpreted the movement as another collapse and accelerated their advance. Morgan adapted immediately. He ordered the withdrawing troops to turn. They faced the British at close range, fired a devastating volley, and charged. American cavalry struck as militia returned to the fight. Tarleton's force broke. More than 800 British troops were killed, wounded, or captured, while American losses were far smaller. Morgan's first withdrawal had been deliberate. The second had begun as a misunderstanding. Both encouraged the British to do the same thing. Advance faster. Only one side's retreat became permanent. Chancellorsville, 1863. Union General Joseph Hooker entered the campaign with roughly twice the manpower available to Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Hooker's army crossed the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers and threatened Lee from the west, while another Union force remained near Fredericksburg. Lee faced an opponent capable of attacking from multiple directions. He responded by dividing his smaller army. Then he divided it again. On May 2nd, Lee and Lieutenant General Thomas Jonathan Jackson launched an extraordinarily risky maneuver. Jackson took roughly 28,000 men on a long march around the Union right flank. That left Lee in front of Hooker with a much smaller force. If the Union army attacked aggressively while Jackson was marching, the separated Confederate forces could be defeated in detail. But that opportunity was not taken. Jackson's column moved for hours through wooded roads. Union observers detected parts of the movement. The problem was not that the Union army saw nothing. The problem was interpretation. Hooker at one point warned Major General Oliver O. Howard that the Confederate movement might threaten his right flank. Other Union officers also reported suspicious activity. But as the day continued, Hooker increasingly interpreted the movement as evidence that Lee's army might be retreating. The Union 11th Corps remained on the exposed right flank. Its defensive preparations against an attack from the west were inadequate. Near evening, Jackson's troops emerged from the woods. They struck the Union flank. The 11th Corps collapsed under the surprise assault. Thousands of soldiers fled eastward toward Chancellorsville as Confederate troops advanced behind them. The maneuver came at a terrible cost. Later that night, Jackson was accidentally shot by Confederate troops while returning from reconnaissance. His left arm was amputated, and he died from pneumonia on May 10. Lee eventually won the battle, but the Confederate army suffered heavy casualties it could scarcely afford. Chancellorsville became one of Lee's most celebrated victories. It also cost him one of his most important commanders. The striking part of the battle was not that the Union army had no warning. It had pieces of the truth. But those pieces never produced the right response in time. These 8 battles did not all use deception in exactly the same way. Themistocles planted false information. Alexander made repeated preparations difficult to distinguish from the real crossing. Hannibal used terrain, pursuit, and battlefield geometry to shape enemy decisions. The Mongols allowed pursuit to stretch an opposing coalition. Napoleon displayed a weakness he expected the enemy to attack. Morgan used a controlled withdrawal and then exploited an accidental one. Lee and Jackson moved while their opponents struggled to determine what that movement actually meant. The common element was not magic, it was uncertainty. An army sees movement, a commander receives information. A formation appears weak. An enemy seems to retreat. Someone must decide what it means. And sometimes the most dangerous mistake is not failing to see what the enemy is doing. It is seeing it clearly and reaching the wrong conclusion.